Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. So we're very excited today to have Giles do a talk. He's done a pre-recorded talk, but he's on the call and will be taking questions afterwards. Just for those of you that are new to Westcountry CSI or haven't heard of it, this is our scheme run by Westcountry Rivers Trust to get citizens out in their local rivers, monitoring for both environmental and water quality parameters. So if you are interested in doing that in your local area, please do email csi@wrt.org.uk. So without further ado, I'll just start the slideshow.
Hello and welcome to this CSI Salmonids in the Westcountry talk.
Yeah, that's working for me.
And I'm the Cornwall Fisheries team leader for Westcountry Rivers Trust. I'll give you just a little bit of background about myself. I joined the trust in 2011. Time goes on, and I've been working on various fisheries and land management projects since then, covering both aspects. I did a
Oh, sorry, we just lost you.
Sorry. Hang on. Oopsie. I'll play from the start again.
So, salmonids. What are salmonids? So there's basically a family of salmonids, which includes Atlantic salmon, which I'll talk about, also the brown trout, and then also as a family, it does cover the Pacific salmon as well. So that includes things like pink salmon, sockeye salmon, rainbow trout found on the Pacific coast of America. And it does also include a few subspecies of trout and salmon found in Europe and Eastern Europe. So if we look at the distribution of salmon, you'll see that most of them are found on the west coast of the country, in those rivers that run to the west. There's also some quite good populations in the northeast of the country as well, but you will see that there aren't very many in the southeast and the east of the country. This is made down to the type of rivers that are there, and lots of kind of land use change and changes, anthropogenic changes that man has created. So originally, I think that you would have had a lot of fish perhaps in the Thames, that's 1,000 years ago. There's very few there now. In comparison, trout, they're found over a wider area of the country, and they're found in a lot more rivers. But also what you tend to find them also is in lots of the smaller rivers, so lots of small coastal rivers and streams. The trout are found there, whereas the salmon tend to be found in these larger rivers, these kind of principal rivers as they're known. So moving on to the brown trout. Salmon tritta. This also includes sea trout, and these used to be thought of as a separate species or subspecies, but analysis and genetics as well has shown that they are the same species. Effectively, it's down to whether the trout decide to stay in the river and reside there and become resident trout, or they decide to go out to sea, get much bigger, much quicker, and come back and spawn. The only other salmonid in England really is the Arctic char, and they're only really found in Cumbria in the north of England. So here is a salmon tritta, a brown trout, and they're a fantastic species, and perhaps undervalued by some and not understood that well. They come in such a variety of sizes, colours, shapes, and they're very adaptable. So they can live in locks, live in rivers, fast-flowing rivers, slow-flowing rivers, and they can be completely varying colour as well. So they can be kind of very dark colours if they're around the River Dart, for example, the Tin-off Dartmoor, and they can be very light, yellowy, silvery colours depending where they are. And this one example, this one's caught in the River Foy in Cornwall, and you'll see this one. He's got a large head, or he or she has a large head. And this one's become predatory, so it's been feeding on other trout, and they tend to develop this larger head. And I expect this fish is probably 7, 8, 9 years old. This is a big trout for the area. And so here you can see a sea trout, and this is a really nice example here. This is a fresh run fish. It's just come back in from the sea into the river. So this is a large fish as well. So obviously been feeding at sea for quite a while. So well, why do they go to sea? Well, it often depends what's happening in the river. And certain rivers, you tend to get a dominance of either brown trout and the fish stay in the river, or you get a lot more sea trout. So quite a lot of our rivers actually in the Westcountry, we do have a lot of sea trout. Other parts of the country, sea trout are much more unusual, and you don't find so many of them. The main reason it's thought is that they can go out to sea, they can feed, and they can get bigger much quicker, and they can produce much more eggs when they come back into the freshwater environment. So it would take them years, or perhaps not even possible for them to get this size in freshwater. However, in marine environment, there's much more food available. They can go and feed, and they come back in and spawn. And actually, we have, say, good numbers of these in the Westcountry. And even last year on the River Foy, there was a sea trout caught of around 20 pounds, or about 1 metre in length. So that gives you some idea of what kind of fish they are. So moving on to genetics, and this is a fascinating field, and something that's really taken off in the last 20 years, but also in particular the last 10 years or so. So overall, both salmon and brown trout are quite closely related, and they can hybridise on occasions. So you will occasionally find something that looks like a sea trout, a brown trout, and a salmon, and then it turns out it's a cross between the two. But what I'm trying to show you here on this complicated diagram here, which isn't as complicated when you try and look at it properly, it really just shows you how closely related these different fish are from different places. So what you tend to find is they tend to cluster. So you've got perhaps, Northern England fish are more closely related to those in Scotland, perhaps, Ireland, a bit more closer to Scotland. And what you can just see here, which is interesting, on the left-hand side, you'll see the fish of Southern England and Northern Spain are relatively closely related, along with those in Northern France. And what it's thought is, on the right-hand side, during the last ice age, those fish were basically, effectively wiped out. So, there was ice sheets over much of the Northern Europe and the UK. Salmon can go to the rivers. However, in Northern Spain, parts of France, and just part of Southern England, it's not in the West Country so much, but Southern England, some of those rivers were kept going, perhaps because they were ground-fed, perhaps. And so it's thought that actually these fish from Northern Spain and Southern England are kind of the original salmon, as it were, that survived through the last ice age, whereas the other fish basically repopulated those areas following the last ice age. So we can find out all kinds of fascinating things through the genetics, and the more we know, the more it tells us, and it's a very useful tool. I think perhaps 5 years ago or so, 10 years ago, we thought it was going to revolutionise everything, and it's just slowed a bit, but I think it will come again. And so trout, something very similar. You can see that basically different estuaries and rivers tend to cluster together. So in red here, you've got tributaries of the Tamar estuary. In blue, you've got the Tamar itself, quite close. On the other side, you've got Land's End in purple, those little rivers there. And then in the green, you've got the Carrick Roads, which is basically the Fowl. So they tend to group together. And you can actually get some difference between rivers itself. And that's what I should have said with the salmon. You can catch a salmon in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles from anywhere, take a genetic swab, and you'll be able to work out which river it's come from. So it's a very interesting tool. With the trout genetics, again, they are quite adaptable, and there's a thing called isolation by distance. So the further apart populations are, the more divergent they tend to be, and the closer they are, more closely related. So some interesting examples of the trout, if you may know the Hale River, right down West Cornwall, in the town of Hale, that river has very high levels of metal. And it's remarkable that any trout can survive in that river. However, when they did a genetic test, they basically found that those trout were completely adapted to that river and those water quality parameters. So when you looked at this sort of tree of relation between the fish. They were completely out on their own. They basically, over time, they changed genetically into their own sort of, not quite a subspecies, but they were quite different over time. So, moving on to the life cycle of the Atlantic salmon, and this image is useful for that, and also gives you quite an idea also of what a sea trout do, and it's similar for brown trout that misses out the stages where they go to sea. But basically, you can see on the lower right hand side here, you've got your breeding pair of fish. So on the right hand side, this is a male fish. It's got this kind of protruding chin known as a kype. So if you see a big salmon with a kype, that's always a male fish. And on the left hand side is a hen fish, female fish. And they'll come up in the autumn, so this time of year, so it's quite topical for now really. They'll move up the river this time of year. And then probably when the water temperature cools in November, December, possibly January, depending where you are, they'll look to spawn together. And what they'll do is they'll form a little nest base in the gravel called a redd. So they'll use their back tail and they'll kick into those gravels, form a little nest. And in that they'll lay their eggs. And then during this early winter, late winter and early spring, they'll turn into alvins. And then by early summer, they'll turn into fry. And then they'll spend the year or so in the river as fry. And that's often when we tend to survey them, monitor them in the river. And then after 1 or 2 years, they'll be par. And again, it can vary when they go from the par stage to the smolt stage. So perhaps a very quick growing, perhaps they'll stay for another year as a par. And if it's a bit slower growing, they'll stay for a couple of years as par. And then they'll go into the smolt stage. And that process of moving from par to smolt is called smoltification. And really, this is the salmon's way of getting ready to go into the marine environment. So you've got very different chemical properties in the marine water, fresh water. So that helps the salmon get ready. And that tends to occur in the spring. So sort of April, May time, those fish will move down through the river. They have to go down over barrows as well as going up them later in the year. And they'll move down into the estuary parts and then they'll go out into the sea. So they'll go into the sea and they'll either spend 1 or 2 years in the sea or longer, and then they'll come back as returning adults. And so linked to that is the kind of migration pattern. So you've got here the kind of main areas that they'll cover. So if those salmon go to sea for 1 year, they'll be called grills, and they're known as grills. And they'll go up to Greenland, Iceland, that kind of area, and then they'll do a loop and come back. If they go up for 2 or 3 years and become multi-sea winter fish, as they're known, they'll go all the way out over to Canada and then up into Greenland and back again. And really, why they do that can depend on food availability and how they get on. So there seems to be quite a variation in years, depending if they go for 1 year or 2 or 3 years, and tend to go in cycles. So sometimes you get them; they'll be big fish and they'll go for longer, or perhaps you'll get more smaller fish. It's all part of sort of adaptability, really. So monitoring, how do we monitor these fish? They're all off at sea, it's not very easy. And monitoring these fish isn't that easy, but we try and do our fish population surveys, and that also gives us ways of recording any change. If we do some habitat works, we can also monitor them before and afterwards. And what we tend to do is we use something called electrofishing. So it can be as dangerous as it sounds, but if you do it right, it's pretty good. If you look on the right-hand side here, that's myself in the hat. So on my right hand, I've got an anode, and on the other side is something called a cathode. And basically, we put an electric pulse between those two, anode and cathode. And if you have the settings right, the fish are attracted to the anode, and you can just basically net them. And if you get the settings right, which you should do, if you take your connectivity and things like that, the fish are uninjured, and you can monitor them and then measure them and then put them back after 10 minutes or so. And this is the main method that is available to monitor these fish. They're not an easy thing to monitor. And all this information helps us understand the kind of the health of the river, what kind of status is it, good, bad, poor health. And also, like I say, it helps us understand where to do work and how effective that work is. So once we've collected this data, we'll put it onto a map. And as you can see here, you've got these series of pie charts. So in the pink, you've got salmon, in the brown, you've got trout. And this just helps us visualise where salmon are, or where trout are, and how those populations vary across those catchments. So what can we do with all this data gathered, and what does our
Oh, sorry, Giles, just disappeared.
Yeah. Try and share again.
approach to fisheries management? Well, what we can use for this data is to assess the health and quality of those rivers and the fish stocks within them. So we tend to use these main three categories. So we've got defend, repair, and attack. So on a river that's defend, this is kind of protecting something that's good. So perhaps the fish stocks are quite good, and we want to maintain them like that. If it's repair, it means you've got some kind of moderate problems and may have moderate fish stocks. So you need some perhaps assisted habitat recovery. You do things like coppicing, things like that, to help improve that. When we move into the red there, into the attack, this is where we've got major problems with the catchment. So perhaps it's got lots and lots of sediment, or there's lots of channel realignment. It's been straightened over the years. It's got major barriers, all kinds of problems. So these ones we need to attack. They are major things we need to try and sort out with them. So when we look at salmon stocks overall, unfortunately, we're on a downward trend, which is a real shame. And indeed, those stock numbers are the lowest point they've ever been since records began in the 1960s. This graph doesn't really carry on all the way to present, but that's basically gone down and down, unfortunately. And this is a real problem. If we look at salmon over the last 20 years, one of the main problems we see is that their return from sea and survival at sea is reduced dramatically from 25% to 5%. And this is a huge problem. On River Tamar, we tend to get about 4 to 5% survival. But you can imagine if next year, if 25% survived, you would get 5 times more fish turn up the following year. So this is a huge problem, and it's kind of one of the most biggest driving factors of what's going on. Absolute numbers, as you've seen earlier, they've reduced from around 10 million to 2.5 million. It may not even be 2.5 million now. And also importantly, only about 40% of these rivers that Atlantic salmon live in actually hold sustainable stocks. So salmon decline is part of a wider problem, unfortunately. So looking at some other reports, there's a WWF report looking at freshwater species. And these groups of species, freshwater species, have seen the biggest decline globally, so declining by 81% since 1970. And also, unfortunately, the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries, with up to half of those fish or animals in decline. So why? Well, a lot of it's down to poor regulation and agricultural practices, diffuse pollution. I talked a bit about store loss before, and I'll talk again about it later. Got water companies. There are still a lot of serious pollution incidents occurring. I think even the last couple of years there's been an increase of those occurring. Over-abstraction, it's a real problem in the southeast of the country. A lot of those chalk streams and rivers are really struggling in the summer, all that demand and so many people there. And you've also got kind of compound pressures, so you've got climate change, temperature, floods, droughts, and we've also got invasive non-natives. And so you've got all of that, but also we've had a 50% reduction in the budget from DEFRA in the last 10 years. We've got some major problems. So, moving on to some of these other problems. So, we've talked about barriers to migration. And this is quite a good schematic or diagram, just showing you how these can be a problem. So, in many ways, we've still got barriers that we had perhaps, 100 years ago. There have been more installed since, but why are barriers that have been around for a long time still a problem now, or perhaps even more of a problem? Well, again, this comes down to kind of fish numbers. So, in this example, 1920, you've got 5,000 fish entering the river. Now, say 75% go over those different weirs, you still get nearly 2,000 fish at the top of the catchment. That's fine. Roll on to 2017. The main problem is you've only got 500 fish entering the catchment. You've got far fewer fish. So when they go over these weirs and barriers, and 75% get over them each time, you end up only having around 45 fish actually making it to the top of the catchment they can spawn. And then you end up getting areas of the catchment that aren't being used for spawning. And also here it notes that perhaps you may have other things like overshading, poor water quality as well. So obviously this is all rather simplified, but in 2020, if you improve these structures by putting in fish passes, if you can get 98% of fish over this one and 98% over that one, you'll end up with nearly 200 fish at the top. And that's enough for them to kind of fill that space there and use all that really useful spawning ground. So let's look at an example of one of these barriers. This is a small weir on the River Lerren, which is a tributary of the Foy. We did a survey on this barrier and basically worked out that salmon and trout could generally pass over the weir in higher flows, and generally that be in the side here. You see kind of during lower flow, and that fish would be very limited in how they could get over that obstacle. So it wasn't in use anymore. It used to service a mill a long time ago, like many of these weirs were, but now it's not being used. And we consulted with the archaeology team, Cornwall Archaeology Unit, and basically they agreed that if we deconstructed it, they could be on site, take some notes, and look at make some notes on its history as we deconstructed it. So that's what it was like. And that was afterwards. It's a complete change, and it's a complete easement now, so salmon can move straight through. And interestingly, the following summer, we surveyed just upstream of this barrier, and we found salmon upstream. So that's a really good, it was a simple and good news story, and just simply illustrates some of the work we can do. Just didn't cost too much to do. Took a while to get all the paperwork lined up. That's what will take us the longest time. But it was a good little example. So, moving on to other types of barriers. This is a more complicated one. So this is actually a ford, which is still being used by the landowner. So people need to kind of cross this still and go back and forth. So this needed much more design and lots of consultation with the landowner, trying to work out what we could do. And it was quite complicated. It took my colleague, David Chapman, quite a while to get this sorted, but they did do it. So this is afterwards. Basically, they created a low flow notch in the middle and reduced the head height of the barrier there. So then basically it was much easier for fish to move up and down through that structure. So they didn't have to make such a jump over that weir. And they've also placed some stones here to maintain the forward shape and raise the water table slightly downstream. So that's one example. So this is another example. This is the River Camel in Camelford. And this is a difficult structure because it's obviously right in the middle of town, so it's not easy to move things. And also it's got a large service pipe just underneath the top of the weir there, so we can't move it easily. And this kind of barrier, again, fish can get over it, and they're known to get over it. However, it can take them several attempts to get over it. So, for example, in this here, they may spend perhaps 2 weeks, 3 weeks downstream of it trying to get over. They may make several attempts. They may make 15, 16, 17 attempts. This is what's been found out when salmon and fish like that have been tagged and monitored moving up and down. So the solution was to attach these baffles to the weir, and these help break up the flow, slow the flow, and there's also like a route or a channel down the middle of the structure which the fish can move upstream. And once this has been installed, monitoring on some of the rivers is showing that perhaps where before, as I mentioned, they may take a couple of weeks to get over this barrier, it may now only take them 2 or 3 days, and they may only have 2 or 3 attempts to get over the barrier. And so this is another example. These are culverts, which can be difficult for trout in particular to get over and through, because basically the water speed is very fast through this culvert. It's a smooth surface, and then fish do actually struggle to get through these. So this is a very simple one. It wasn't really used as a crossing anymore. We could just remove these and repair the banks, and this was done in a day. If you had to have the crossing still, you would perhaps put in a proper road or footbridge. So, moving on. Soil loss. This is a massive issue, and a particular issue in the Westcountry. We have a lot of sloping fields and we have a lot of rain. And the combination of that together often leads to lots of runoff, and often that runoff has a lot of soil with it. If you have exposed fields over the winter, you tend to get a lot of runoff, and if you have perhaps poached fields as well, you get also a lot of soil erosion. So this is the sort of thing you might see. You've got soil running off from the field, down into the road and then into the river, causing lots of problems. That sediment might have originated from a field like this. You've got perhaps probably a late sown winter cereal of some kind, perhaps. You've got a lot of erosion guys taking place there. And this is causing a real problem. So what does this mean for fish? Well, the problem is all this sediment and soil gets into the river and into the gravels. And as we saw earlier, fish, salmon species in particular, spawn in these gravels. And this is quite often what separates salmonid fish from other kinds of coarse fish and other species. They do need these clean gravels to survive, and if they don't have that, they really can't spawn properly. So this little video just shows you what you see when you have a gravel covered in silt and a clean gravel. Here's a very silty gravel. This is the clean one. So it's actually the same spot after it's been cleaned. And so this gravel's got to be clean for those juvenile fish and eggs to survive. And this is one of the biggest problems we're now facing. It's kind of like a chronic illness. If it's a person, this is some of the long-term chronic illness. So not the sort of thing you jump up and down straight away. The problem is that the fish struggle to reproduce, and just over time, populations gradually decline, and this is the big problem. So some of the other major work we can do is improving the habitat in our rivers. Quite a lot of those habitats have become degraded over time. Perhaps they're not being managed in the same way as they were before, or they lack certain features. So we can do different things. We've got different tools we can use. So one of the main problems we actually find actually a lot in Westcountry rivers is we do have a lot of overshading. So historically, perhaps up to 30, 40 years ago, you saw a lot of river and bankside coppicing. There was a demand for coppiced wood, which is used for various things. That demand is now gone. So now we have a lot of abandoned coppice, so we have a lot of kind of multi-stem trees by the riverbank, and it's actually more shaded than it would be naturally. Also, we do work to introduce woody material into the bank, and we also look at controlling erosion. So if we look at some examples of these, here you've got some coppicing work. So they've taken back these coppices here, and what they tend to do is leave sort of one tree in the coppice. So let's hope that that would turn into kind of one mature tree, and that will reduce the amount of shade on the river. So why do we want to reduce the amount of shade sometimes? Well, we tend to do it in specific areas. It's where the juvenile fish live. And if we can increase the light a bit more, we basically allow more primary productivity, and there's more algae and more invertebrates. And it's thought to particularly affect salmon. However, it's very important that we still maintain a good amount of shade as the air temperature is warming. Generally, we've got climate change issues. So we want to kind of get sort of 70% shade, 30% light, or even 80% shade, 20% light. But getting those areas of light into shallow areas where the juvenile fish live is very important. And on the right side, you can see there's kind of some brash material laid into the river, and that helps provide refuge for fish to hide. There's also a good place for invertebrates and things like that as well. So in this picture, the team have been undertaking some crown raising. So they have to climb the tree and basically take off different limbs to help increase the amount of light hitting the bed. But what is really useful with this technique is that it allows for the tree to remain in place. So it still provides all that habitat, helps bind the bank and the soil still, but it does allow more light into the river. So, in summary, unfortunately, our salmon do face a myriad of pressures and challenges, not change, which really will affect the Westcountry first. So we're at the kind of the southerly range of Atlantic salmon, other than bits of France and Spain. So they're going to struggle here first. And a lot of that's down to not only summer temperatures of water, but also during the winter when they're spawning. The eggs survive much better when that water is clear and also cool. So, however, slightly better news, trout. They are very adaptable, and given the right conditions, they can recover. And if you provide them with good habitat or help clean the gravels or better water quality, they will often recolonise areas. Their populations can improve well. They're very genetically plastic, so they're able to adapt to a lot of challenges and things like that. So they are very good at that. And something just for you to sort of take away, I think, is that they are kind of the canaries of our rivers. These salmon fish, both trout and salmon. If you've got a river that kind of looks like it's working okay, but doesn't have any trout or salmon or very low numbers, there probably is something wrong there going on. So whether could be anything, could be microplastics or chemicals or sediment, something like that. So they do tell us a lot about the river and the health of our rivers. And so some people are just interested in fisheries, and that's what they're interested in. But even if you're not that interested in that, or that's not your thing so much, they really do tell you these things. And you could do lots of monitoring and not really work out what is wrong with the river. But if the fish aren't there, there's a problem of some kind. So that's the main take-home message. And time for questions.
Thank you very much, Giles. That was really interesting. I certainly learnt a lot. So that was great. So we're opening up to any of your questions. So you're all muted at the moment. You just have to unmute yourself or raise your hand is probably the best way in case there's lots of questions. You can also write them in the chat. There's a conversation button at the top there. Any questions from people? Robert, if you'd like to unmute yourself. Oh. And Jenny has whilst Robert, are you struggling to find the unmute button, Robert? It's just at the top there. There should be a microphone. Jenny has a question for you, Giles. Is the presence of brown trout in streams an indication of fairly good water quality?
Yes, I would say effectively. Obviously, there's kind of a continuum. So some fish is good, lots of fish is better. But no, it is. They are quite sensitive to water quality. So some of the species like perhaps eels or lamprey, they're not so sensitive to water quality. Whereas the brown trout will be pretty sensitive. So you'll kind of already be in that sort of moderate to good state, if that makes sense. As I said, a lot of our rivers suffer from sediment and all kinds of other problems, and the trout struggle to spawn when that's the case. So if you have got fish there, that's good. And so quite importantly, if you've got the juvenile fish, that's quite important. So people always think about looking for bigger fish and things, but if you've got lots of the small fish, that's often actually the best indicator. So that means they're spawning well and they're surviving, the eggs are surviving, and they're reproducing properly. So actually often a healthy river is one that's actually full of lots of little fish.
Cool. That's interesting. Hopefully interesting for the Plymouth River Keepers project actually as well, probably why Jenny asked. So Robert asks, what is the benefit of brash in habitat improvements?
Yeah, sure, that's a good question, and it's something we've done quite a lot more of the last I don't know, perhaps 5 to 10 years. Really, it's basically providing more habitat in the river, and you get sort of a greater flows, and you get it's also importantly it's a space for invertebrates to use. So the invertebrates will use it. They'll also kind of seek shelter in there, and that also means the trout will eat the invertebrates, and also they'll also use it as kind of refuge or somewhere to hide. So if you've got a a cormorant, for example, something like a predatory bird, the fish can hide in the brash. And I think perhaps historically there's a tendency to clear a lot of debris and trees from the river, and I think that we can see now that there is actually a benefit to having some sort of brash material on the riverbank. So not only does it provide habitat for fish directly, but it also helps stabilise banks as well, so it helps reduce erosion and things like that. So if you get a major blocker, sometimes that's worth removing, and we'll try and assess that. So when we look at these blockers, we'll try and work out if it's the sort of thing that should come out, or actually it's a useful feature and it should remain in place. So I think there's a bit of a culture change within leaving more stuff in rivers where we can.
And Stephen asks, what impact do beavers and beaver dams have on migrating and spawning salmonids? My interest especially as regards to trouts.
Yeah. Okay. Well, very interesting. Very topical at the minute. I think it's a mixed bag. So you know, when we talk about those kind of naturally functioning ecosystems, you know, beavers are probably part of that. Probably some of the problems we've got at the moment, as I kind of alluded to in that diagram, was part of the problem is we do have less fish than we used to, and so there are less fish to get over these barriers. I think with the beaver dams, what they can do is kind of create quite good sort of wetland habitats, and you can actually often get some quite large trout. And there's quite good conditions for trouts in those kind of pools they form, but it would be more difficult for the sea trout. So what you may end up getting is a river system that perhaps moves towards more being trout-based with brown trout, and perhaps less sea trout, if that makes sense. So it may be that the conditions change, that the trout become more resident, and they go to sea less. Spawning wise, I think it just needs to ensure that they still have some kind of the right areas to spawn, and not too many sort of dams. But I think the beavers tend to pick their places for it, and they tend to work on the shallow water where they want to make it deeper. But a good question.
And is fish farming altering wild populations?
Yeah, I mean, I think down here we're probably a bit luckier. We don't have any. I'm so aware of sort of salmon fish farms, and we tend to get away with that a bit. But yeah, certainly in Scotland there are problems with it. There's some kind of there are kind of some interbreeding, but I think a lot of the problems are actually around kind of diseases basically, and things like that. So the wild the farm populations, they tend to have a lot of diseases with them, and a lot of those, they're often in areas where the wild salmon pass by and then pick up these diseases. So these might be kind of various types of flatworms or similar things. So yeah, they do cause quite a lot of problems, and they're often in the sort of mouth of estuaries and things like that. So they tend to mix with the wild salmon. Generally, the farm salmon, if they do escape, they tend to die off generally at some point, or they tend to not spawn so well, and they genetically they tend to disappear normally.
Right. Okay. Does electrofishing pick up the juvenile fish or just the larger ones?
Well, it depends who's surveying, what people are after, but we're generally supposed to be surveying the small fish, the juveniles. But you can pick up both. It is better for juvenile fish really, because it's much easier to survey the shallow areas. Often the bigger fish tend to go into the bigger pools, and then it just starts getting too deep to actually survey and catch them properly. So you can alter your technique depending on what you want to catch. But we tend to use them in the truss for juvenile fish. We tend to do quite quick and short surveys for juvenile fish in shallow water.
And Howard asks, catch and release is well established for freshwater fish such as brown trout, but how effective is it for migratory fish such as salmon?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think I've said generally now it's most of these places have got what's the word, sort of voluntary catch and release. So they're kind of aiming to get 90% or so. I think the most recent kind of update in regulations has shown that because salmon are struggling so much, we really need to move to a catch and release where possible, and that's kind of what the enforcement is. Generally, it does work pretty well. I think one of the main things actually is water temperature. So if a fish is caught in warmer water, it will struggle more when it's put back and it take longer to recover. If it's caught in cooler water, they tend to recover faster. So, and also depends a little bit what you catch them with. But if you're fishing in cooler water with sort of barbless hooks and things, it tends to work pretty well. And I think there's something like a 90%, or 90% plus recovery by the fish. It's pretty good. And I have seen sometimes they talk about regulating fishing even. So if the water's too warm, don't fish. And that could be something you could do to improve those rates potentially.
Yeah, and that's actually quite a good point for this leading on the CSI. You know, that's one of the reasons we taking water temperature readings are so important, because obviously our rivers are rapidly increasing in temperature over the years. Ian asks, has the recovery of the otter population had a significant impact on salmonid population numbers?
Okay, yeah, hi Ian, that is a good question actually. I expect it will have to some degree, although I do know that otters, I think they do sort of preferentially go for eels, I think, and they're quite keen on eels, lamprey and bullhead. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. They will be affecting them to some extent, I'm sure. I think they would probably go for slightly bigger trout, probably fish. So that might leave the juveniles. So yeah, I think they do, but we don't know quite how much. But I would say it's mitigated to some respect by the fact that probably the bullheads and things are more numerous, and they'll probably day to day feed a lot on them.
Right. And Kieran asks, is the reduction of soil erosion in relation to salmonid spawning more important in gravel-bedded upland rivers rather than naturally silt-bedded lowlands? Linked to this is upland agricultural management, therefore more important in relation to salmonids?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. I think, yes, I suppose where you've got salmon, they probably tend to be in those rivers that are certainly a rise in the uplands, and I suppose that's why they tend to be on the west coast. So yes, it probably is more to do with the soil loss in those regions. I say also they tend to be steep sloping, they tend to be wetter, so you get a lot of soil loss. So probably the true uplands aren't so bad, because you've got poaching, but you haven't got so much, you're not having crops harvested, and you're not having things ploughed. But when you step down from the moorland area into the better ground, but still sloping, and it's being, they may now be grown for maize when it used to be grass or various things. I think this is where having the big problems. As you say, some of the sort of more silted lowland rivers, there probably aren't so many salmon there anyway, and the trout, perhaps they probably may spawn in some of the little side tributaries. So yeah, tricky question, that one.
And Robert asks, do the fish easements allow passage of smaller species to like bullheads?
So yeah, designing fish easements is pretty complicated. So we always try and start with a removal if we can. And removal is best, and we will always try and do that, and it often comes down to the landowner. If it's a flood risk, it could be in town somewhere, so it may not be possible, and then we tend to try and get a fish passage that works for all species. So we tend to talk about things like these sort of like a Lorinier fish pass, it's called, which looks like a big piece of corrugated metal, but that allows almost all fish species to get over, because it basically helps slow the water enough so they can get over. If that can't be done, or it's very expensive, we then try to look at things called, we basically call them an easement, and we'll basically try and put a series of steps into the weir rather than just having it as one big jump. So we do try to, and that's always the plan. But it's all down to often the constraints of the site. So it may be very remote, or maybe very expensive, or just not possible. But we do try to, if possible.
Brilliant. And Howard asks, are there any rivers in the southwest which have self-sustaining stocks of salmon, or are they all in trouble?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. There are a few that are doing better. So probably the River Tyne off Dartmoor, that is doing well, and I think that would be considered self-sustaining at the moment. Very interesting. That's doing pretty well, and the Dart is struggling. Which is odd because obviously they start kind of next to each other almost, and they're very similar. So again, it's interesting. There are issues with acidity potential in the Dart, and it'd be very interesting to work out if that was the main problem. So there are a few. That one's doing well. There's a few sort of tributaries of rivers, like the Lid that runs into the Tamar, that comes off Dartmoor as well. That's doing pretty well. Yeah, they would be the best rivers in the southwest. A lot of the other ones are struggling a bit. Until recently, the River Camel was doing well in Cornwall, but literally the last about 4 years or so, they had a poor season about 3 years ago, and everyone started worrying a bit. Right.
Yeah, and then Stephen asks, might changing currents in the Atlantic be having an effect on the salmonid and eel migration as well?
Yes, that's interesting. I think quite possibly. So I think quite a lot of these things are down to, so when they're feeding on things like krill and other fish in the sea, I expect a lot of their prey items, then things they feed on, have probably moved north or have moved elsewhere. So I'm not quite sure about the currents themselves, but that is quite possible. And these things do vary. And there's quite a lot of sort of cyclical things that happen. So, you get a lot of variation each year. So I wouldn't doubt that is a problem, and or could be an issue. And I say I think because their food has drifted and probably drifted north because of climate change, the salmon are then having to go further, and they're often perhaps not getting enough food on the route further north, and that's probably why we're getting these very poor at-sea survival.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you very much, Giles. Well, I think we'll wrap it up there. That was great, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope you all enjoyed it, and just to repeat myself, that if you are interested in CSI, if you're not signed up already, then please do email if you're interested. And I hope you all have a lovely day in the sunshine. Bye everybody.
Cheers, thanks all.